I'm chair of the International Advisory Board of Pambazuka News. Pambazuka News is a Pan-African bi-weekly online newsletter that seeks to inform and raise awareness of individuals, movements, and organizations on the struggles of global Africans, struggles for their political liberation, social justice, and reparations. So welcome to Pambazuka's News Second Town Hall. Today, I'll hand over to my co-chair, Tennyson Joseph, who's going to introduce himself and tell you about the town hall theme today. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat, and good day and good evening and good night to listeners in global land. Welcome to Pambazuka's Town Hall meeting on the very current issue of the Bolivarian Revolution and its enemies. And we're exploring the very recent issue of the U.S. aggression towards Venezuela, including the inclusive of the kidnapping of its president and the First Lady Celia Flores in the age of the decline of empire. So our town hall today is seeking to reach out to global Africa to center the question of the role and place of empire in its dying days, and in specific relation to the recent events we saw taking place in Venezuela, but also we are hoping to make connections to wider global issues. My name is Tennyson Joseph. I'm a member of the Global Pan-African Movement, North American chapter. I am an associate professor in political science at North Carolina Central University. I am from the Eastern Caribbean and from St. Lucia, the island of St. Lucia specifically. Our program today is hoping to connect the rest of the world to what is happening in Venezuela. We are very conscious of sometimes we in the global south tend to see our destinies as disparate and our issues as separate. And what we are seeking to do today is to connect these events so that we can all see ourselves in the global south as facing a common enemy and facing common challenges. And that is what we hope to focus on in our discussions today. I will be the co-host for the first part of this panel discussion, this town hall. And our first section of the program focuses on Venezuela, inside Venezuela. So we hope to provide for you some broad insights into the politics of Venezuela, the political economy of Venezuela, its culture, and its place in its relation to the Pan-African movement, and its place in third world struggles in general. And to do so, I will have the honor of introducing two of our speakers for the first section, one of whom is already in the room, and the other will join us shortly. So our first speaker will be Professor Leila Brown. She is an assistant professor of cultural anthropology and Africana studies and affiliate faculty in women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Northeastern University. She has a very strong Pan-African focus in her research. Her research focuses on Pan-African socialist and feminist social movements in Venezuela, the US, and the broader African diaspora. She's a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, and that gives her the political legitimacy to speak on the question that we are focusing on today from a Pan-African perspective. And she's currently working on her first book, which we are all looking forward to see come out in print. Her current manuscript is now entitled Forward Ever, The Political Afterlives of Pan-Africanism in the 21st Century. So Leila will be our first speaker looking at the questions of race relations and the Afro-Venezuelan condition, as well as the broader internal politics of Venezuela, to kind of set the context for us. Our second speaker will be Ambassador Marta Ortega Pereza. She is the current charge d'affaires of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in Barbados. She was very instrumental in organizing a very influential discussion on Venezuela and its place in the in the Caribbean in general, which went very, very well. She also comes to us with with an academic background. She is professor at the Pedro Gual Institute of Higher Diplomatic Studies of the Venezuelan Ministry of Foreign Affairs and, and at the University of the Hydrocarbons in Venezuela. She's a political scientist by training, and she also had a tremendous role to play in PDVSA, which is the Venezuela oil company. And she was the first female president of PDVSA subsidiaries in South America, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Uruguay, and Paraguay. So that means she can speak to us a lot about the questions of energy and the oil issue. And she served for 8 years as head of international and public affairs at PDVSA. And she was also responsible for the Mirror Commission within the Petrocaribe framework. So she's worked within Petrocaribe and within PDVSA, and she's the current ambassador, Venezuelan ambassador to Barbados. So she will be giving us some very critical insights on developments that are taking place in Venezuela today and in light of the recent developments. So I will now call on Therese, our linguist, to translate or do a Spanish
Sorry?
interpretation of our introduction, and following Therese's intervention, we will move immediately to Leila, who will start the discussion going. Therese?
Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Therese Millet Joseph y soy miembro ejecutiva del Movimiento Panafricano Global, capítulo norteamericano. Mi función hoy es proporcionar traducciones al español para nuestros hispanohablantes, específicamente durante la sección de preguntas y respuestas. Les doy la bienvenida a este foro de Pambazuka, en el que hablaremos sobre la revolución bolivariana en Venezuela y sus enemigos. Pambazuka News es el sitio web y boletín informativo panafricano de referencia en materia de justicia social en África y el sur global, que ofrece comentarios de vanguardia y análisis en profundidad sobre la lucha por la libertad y la justicia. Es producido por una comunidad de ciudadanos y organizaciones, académicos, responsables políticos, activistas sociales, organizaciones de mujeres, organizaciones de la sociedad civil, escritores, artistas, poetas, blogueros y comentaristas que juntos elaboran análisis agudos y reflexivos. Con más de 600,000 lectores, es uno de los foros web de justicia social más grandes, innovadores e influyentes de África. Está disponible por correo electrónico y en internet en inglés, francés y portugués. Tennyson Joseph y Patricia Daly moderarán el foro de hoy. La primera parte se centrará en el panorama político actual en Venezuela. Nuestra primera oradora será la doctora Leila Brown. Leila Brown es profesora asistente de Antropología Cultural y Estudios Africanos y profesora afiliada de Estudio de la Mujer, Género y Sexualidad en la Universidad Northeastern. Su investigación se centra en los movimientos sociales panafricanos, socialistas y feministas en Venezuela, en los Estados Unidos y la diáspora africana en general. Y la segunda oradora va a ser la señora Marta Ortega Peraza, que es la encargada de negocios de la legación de Venezuela en Barbados. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Therese. And Leila, Brown, Professor Lila Brown, you may begin your intervention. You will have about 10 minutes for your presentation.
Okay. All right, thank you. I didn't actually realize, Tennyson, that you are at North Carolina Central University. That is my alma mater, and I open with that because that is actually the place where I was introduced to Venezuela. So I was a history and Spanish double major, and I had a professor who was Afro-Mexican, Marco Polo Hernandez Cuevas, who had brought Chucho Garcia to campus several times when I was an undergrad. And I remember, because of my family's own organizing history as an undergrad when I was considering going to graduate school, one of the things my father said to me was that in watching Venezuela at that moment, so we're talking about between 2005 and 2009, he said Venezuela has the potential to be for your generation what Cuba was for my generation, a place where Black left radicals could potentially find refuge, a place for as an example. And so when I got ready to pursue graduate studies, that was why I started looking at the Bolivarian Revolution. And another reason was because we spent many years organizing African Liberation Day in Washington D.C. And one year, I think in 2008, I had stumbled upon a conference at Howard University, a What's Up with Venezuela Now, and there were all of these Afro-Venezuelans talking about how the Bolivarian Revolution had changed their lives for the better. And so I start there to kind of give a sense to people that even, depending on what you see and what you get in the US, people don't necessarily always think about Venezuela as a place that has a significant Afro-descendant population. And so I'm just going to share one brief graphic that came out of the 2011 census that occurred, which was at the time the first census to count the Venezuelan population by race. And so at the time, the results of the 2011 census asked the following question: according to your physical features, ancestry, culture, and traditions, do you consider yourself to be negro or black, afrodescendiente or African descent? Moreno, which for our purposes is there's an explicit understanding that Moreno as brown has a direct a mixture of African descendantness, and then there was Blanco, Indígena, like other categories as well. And so, according to the 2011 census, about 53% of the Venezuelan population identified in some way as of African descent. And so I just wanted to share that. And one of the reasons why that even came to be possible is because of a series of organizations that existed that came to be known as the Network of Afro-Venezuelans. Some of the kind of early iterations of that were an organization called Afro America 21, was it 20 or 21, that Chucho Garcia had started. There subsequently has been a consolidation of Afro-descendant intellectuals, academics, cultural artists, and that is kind of what went on to form the Network of Afro-Venezuelans, which was formed in the year 2000. So if we know that the Bolivarian Revolution triumphed in 1998, right? So Hugo Chavez comes to power in 1998. The Bolivarian Constitution is rewritten. And obviously, Chavez comes to power as a progressive leftist, but there is this moment that I think people really have to sort of pay attention to, which is kind of similar to the moment that we're in right now, which was the 2002 coup d'état. And that 2002 coup d'état was a moment where, for a matter of a couple of days, Hugo Chavez was temporarily removed from power, but the Venezuelan people in particular was so adamant about the fact that they wanted him back that they basically had no choice but to bring Chavez back to power. Now, I also kind of bring this moment up because it is also a pivotal moment in Chavez's own sort of racial identification. So yes, Chavez is we most of us, if we follow Chavez, we know that he identified as Afro-Indigenous, but this was something that really came to be as a result of pushing from the grassroots organizations of Afro-descendants in the country, right? So obviously Chavez grew up a poor, farming campesino. He joined the military. He had progressive politics, all of those things. But because of the history of race and racialization in Latin America, there had been a long sort of erasure of what it meant to be a person of African descent, a person who was a descendant of people who were formerly enslaved. And so as a result, of being further sort of deepening the grassroots movement and deepening connections between the Afro-Venezuelans and the Bolivarian Revolution. 2002 becomes this kind of pivotal moment where Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution really kind of deeply acknowledges how important kind of the popular power of the people is, and they start to kind of take on more of the rhetoric of the women, of the Afro descendants, of the indigenous people, of the poor people of the country. So this really does become a kind of pivotal moment. And the reason why I raise this is because over the years, it comes to be kind of understood inside of the country that to be Chavista is to be Black. To be Chavista is to be indigenous. To be Chavista is to be poor, right? To be Chavista is to be what the previously existing kind of bourgeois class would call the dregs of society. And so when we look at what's happening in Venezuela right now, we have to really make that deep connection with the fact that an attack on the Bolivarian Revolution is really an attack on a particular kind of Afro-descendant Black sovereignty. Not that alone, obviously, but because of the ways that the Afro-Venezuelan population have been so deeply embedded in the Bolivarian process, we do really have to look at this as an example, like an example that the world is attempting to set, that because the Bolivarian Revolution became so responsive to the needs, to the wants, to the kind of political pushings of the Afro descendant population, we really begin to see one of the things that I try to argue in my book that I'm working on is that Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution, up until maybe the Sahel, what is happening in the Sahel is one of the only really sustained state level examples of Pan-Africanism that we see in the 21st century. And so it becomes really important, I think, for us to follow, what is happening in Venezuela. And I think as much as we look to the Cuban Revolution as a particular kind of example for those of us on the left, Venezuela did go a very different route than Cuba. Venezuela did not, Chavez had conversations with Castro kind of early on. Castro made comments about the fact that, he had some regrets about how he dealt with the question of race. And so kind of very early on, Chavez learned that lesson. And because of that, we see a deeper entwining of Blackness and Chavismo. And one of the kind of obvious examples we see of that is actually in after the death of Chavez. But it was, let me get the year right. It was either 2017 or 2018 when Orlando Figuera was at the time, Maduro referred to it as a lynching. He was an Afro-Venezuelan who was leaving from work that day. This is during the time of the Guarimbas. This is the kind of right-wing protests that are occurring in the country around the time where they're trying to impose Juan Guaido as the president at the time. And he's basically singled out in the midst of these protests because of his Blackness, but his Blackness is conflated with his status as a Chavista, right? And that the Blackness and the fact that Blackness and Chavismo are seen as basically one and the same makes him a target, and it ultimately in this moment costs him his life, right? And so, there are multiple ways in which the right in Venezuela attempts to attack the Bolivarian Revolution on explicitly racial terms, right? There was this cartoon that like won this National Latin American Illustration Prize where it's I think that was what in 2011, 2013. It's a cartoon picture of Chavez as like a gorilla, right? There's a this bloodthirsty gorilla, and he has this bat, and he is basically like beating the freedom and liberty out of the rest of Latin America, right? But also we know that monkeys, gorillas, and even in the case of Maduro, who is often racially depicted as like a mule or mulatto, right? In the kind of right-wing Venezuelan press and elsewhere in the world, we see this kind of ongoing attempt to racialize the Bolivarian process. But also from the other side, I want to make a little bit more affirmative statement about this. In 2011, which was the bicentennial anniversary of Venezuela's independence, there were all of these images that were coming out of Simon Bolivar at the time. And there was a lot of controversy at the time about people attempting to whiten Simon Bolivar's image. And I remember actually being at the Institute of Pedro Gual at one of the training sessions where members in the room started talking about this woman, Hipólito Bolivar. And I don't know if you all know who Hipólito Bolivar was, but Hipólito Bolivar was an enslaved African woman who essentially was Simon Bolivar's caregiver as a child. And one of the stories that I heard through the Afro-Venezuelan networks is that, all of the ways in which we come to understand Simon Bolivar as a sort of ideologue of Latin American liberation is largely as a result of his rearing by this woman, this Afro-descendant woman, or actually at the time probably African woman, who helped sort of sow and plant the seeds of freedom, of liberation. And I haven't done a whole lot to really determine how true that is. I don't actually even think that it matters how much it's true in terms of like being able to determine it. What I think is important from it for me is that it's one of the ways that the Afro-Venezuelan population is attempting to make a claim on the foundation of the liberatory project, not just of the Bolivarian Revolution in 1998, but also of Latin American liberation writ large. And that would be Venezuela, what was Gran Colombia, right? So Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, Panama at this particular time. And, also we know that in order for Simon Bolivar to liberate this territory, he's not able to do this without the assistance of Pétion in Haiti, right? Without the assistance of Haitian troops, Haitian weapons. And so what I found really sort of fascinating about what the Afro-Venezuelan network and Afro-Venezuelan scholars and activists were attempting to do is to right the wrongs of being erased in this particular kind of way that we see not just the Bolivarian but Venezuelan, like prior to the existence of the Bolivarian Revolution, ideas of left kind of liberatory politics in Latin America. And so, I continue to look at the Bolivarian Revolution, even in the midst of sort of what's going on now. Like, yes, obviously, during Chavez's time alive, you would be hard pressed to find any Afro-descendant person who was not in support of the Bolivarian Revolution. There have been some shifts, I think, but I think that really has to do more with the pressure of the sanctions, because so much of the ways that the social programs were organized to support poor, indigenous, women, Afro-descendant people in Venezuela came through oil revenue. And so we know that the US government attempts to impose sanctions in order to weaken the resolve of the populations of people. We've seen them try to do that in Cuba for 70 years, and they are actually intensifying that in Cuba right now at this moment. And so I like to look at what is happening in Venezuela. There are many things that are occurring, but I think for myself as a Pan-Africanist, it is particularly important to see the work that is being done to attempt to weaken the resolve of us as Pan-Africanists, attempting to understand, as Tennyson said in the opening, who our common enemies are and why it matters for us to continue to work together. And I'll end on that note. So I'll turn it over there.
That's an excellent note on which to end. I think what you have done for us is to locate the Venezuelan Revolution, the Bolivarian Revolution, as a Pan-African revolution, to locate it in its Black underclass global struggle context. And I think you have set the pace for our subsequent discussions, which will follow. And I'm sure our participants will come back to you with some more questions later. Thank you very much. Ambassador Marta, you may go right ahead and make your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Hi. Good afternoon to all. Good evening to some of you. Thank you for the invitation and to prepare this activity, because it's important to discuss what is happening in different point of view, and also to have the possibility to analyze together what is happening in Venezuela, because what is happening in Venezuela is not only in Venezuela, it's a consequence that what is happening in the world now. So thank you for organizing this activity, for inviting me. It's an honor for me on the behalf of our president, constitutional president, Nicolás Maduro Moros, that is still our president, even if he's kidnapping in United States and his wife. I want to thank of all of you and of course our acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, that is the first woman as a president of Venezuela. No, that is important to say that. And I want to, well, we have a previous conversation, but first I want to make a comment about what the Professor Laila said. Sometimes when I was studying my master at the Simón Bolívar University in Venezuela, one colleague in a class, after a discussion of participatory democracy and that, she said to me, "You are too white and too smart to be a Chavista." That's represent what you explained in a small comment, you know? Why? And for her was difficult because when we have discussions, so many times she said, "But you are right, but I cannot understand why." And she always say, "You are too white and too smart to be Chavista." And I think that that ratifies what you are saying, Laila. No? Well, as you know, during the revolution, the revolution started with the President Maduro, when the President Chavez won the election in 1998. When President Chavez won the election, the first things that the President Chavez did is to change the constitution and to ask the people of Venezuela what matters we have to include in that constitution. And in December, the period of government started each February the 2nd. So during the year 1999, we work in different consultations. Excuse me? Okay, we were in the consultation for the constitution, and now we have is the constitution that we are applying in this moment. That constitution also have the approval of the people of Venezuela in a election. Almost 80% of the people of Venezuela approve the constitution, and that constitution change a lot of things. I don't have enough time to explain, but there are a few things that we have to know. First, the Constitution talk about, of course, sovereignty, the republic, but the Constitution ratifies that the government of Venezuela and the institution have to represent the people of Venezuela, and they include also the democracy, the participatory democracy, include that the indigenous people have the right to speak their own language, and that language have I consider official language of the country, that recognize, for example, that the indigenous people have their own territory. We talked a little about that last time. As Laila said, that is not include, for example, for the Afro-descendant communities, but was included for the indigenous people. And in that constitution, we create different mechanisms for a strong institution, you know. And during this period, as Laila explained, in 2002, we have a coup d'etat against President Chavez. They took President Chavez, but they maintained him kidnapping, but inside the country. So the difference now is they kidnapping the president, and they have now the President Maduro inside, in the heart of the empire, as I said before. And after that, we have different situations. We have a strike of oil company. We have different guarimbas. We have coup d'etat. They tried to put Juan Guaido as a president. he said that he himself that he's the president of the country in a square. So they are trying to do different things against the country. But the reason why they are working in that is because the model of Venezuela, what we want to do for our country, but also what we have trying to do for the region, represent as the perspective of United States at a threat against them. Because we said, for example, and if you see the first speech of the president, acting president Delcy Rodriguez, I will send to you with the translation in English. She said that we have a historical confrontation between the point of view, between the perspectives of the Bolivarian point of view and the Monroe Doctrine. That means that in the case of Venezuela, we have been leading a different mechanism of integration as ALBA, as Petrocaribe, as CELAC, because we know and we believe that only with the integration of the region we can resist and confront and develop ourselves against the attack of this imperialism. No, so many people ask me even in a private meetings or in public meetings, what happened in Venezuela now? How is possible that after a strike and after kidnapping the president and after 3 months of blockade of our coast and after more than 10 years of blockade and coercive measure against the country that means that we have a lot of difficulties to develop the country, to buy equipment for subway, for electricity, for all that things. How is possible that still the government of Venezuela is in the hands of the vice president, now acting president Delcy Rodriguez, that is the second authority in the government of Venezuela, and she is, of course, a Chavista person, a revolutionary person. The first thing that I have to tell you is, when even after the strike, they have been expecting that the people of Venezuela came to the street, I don't know, maybe asking for Maria Corina or tell them that they are doing very well, but that didn't happen. Because the first thing that happened is that the people of Venezuela came to the street, asked to condemn the aggression and to demand the return of the president and his wife. Since the first day, the January the 3rd at 10 a.m. were people in the street asking, condemning the aggression and asking for the president. At the first moment, the people asked for proof of life of the President Maduro, and then when we know that he is alive, we ask that he come back to the country. And what that happened and what, for example, the country is in peace now. Of course, it's a difficult situation. We have a strike less than a month. More than 100 people were killed by the United States. More than 100 people were injured, and between civilians and military, no? And also 32 Cubans were killed by United States, protecting the life of the President Maduro and the great homeland, no? Because, as you know, as Martí said, this is our America. But this America and the great homeland, we have to protect that together, no? And the institution in Venezuela and the state in Venezuela is working. We built during this year the revolution and the government and the leadership of the President Maduro, the leadership of the President Chavez, and now the leadership of Delcy Rodriguez and others members of our government are working really hard to create conditions for the people of Venezuela and for the institution of Venezuela works. No, and when I talk about the institutions, I know I talk about, of course, about the executive, about the parliament, about the high court, about the police force, about the defense force, but I also talk about the council, the communal council, and the communities and the organization of the people of Venezuela in different communities that understand that the power of the people of Venezuela is what sustain the state and sustain the country. Is the base of everything in the country. It's the base of the constitution, is the base of our democracy, is the base of the state that cannot work without the people of Venezuela. And so the mechanism provided by our constitution, approved by the people of Venezuela in December 1999, were implemented at the Vice President Delcy Rodriguez took the office as acting president with the support of the peaceful Venezuelan people. And that means that is because Venezuelan people, not only Chavismo, the Venezuelan people in general, even some people of the opposition, because if something if someone have a confusion before the January the 3rd and believe that the opposition wins some election and that now they realize that it's not true. It's clear that President Maduro win the election, that we have the majority of the people, but after the strike, the people of Venezuela understand that it's an aggression against the country. It's not only an aggression against Nicolás Maduro or against the revolution or against the government. And if you can see some, you can check some interviews of parliamentaries of the opposition, different parties, and they agree that the attack is against the country, and we have to work together to protect the sovereignty, the republic, and the rights of the people of Venezuela. And now, because the president, Delcy Rodriguez, acting president Delcy Rodriguez, is working in the mechanism to protect the peace of the country. But the peace of the country is not only the absence of war, it's also the possibility that we have and the right that we have to develop our country as we want, as we believe, no, as a people, no. The 2 days after the strike, the January the 5th, the National Assembly, by constitution, the National Assembly has to entail the parliamentary year every February the 5th. But this year, also a new parliament have to start because we had an election of parliament last year. So January the 5th, 2 days after the strike, the new parliament with members, of course, majority of the Chavismo because we win that election, and also members of the different opposition parties in Venezuela, install the new National Assembly. And after that, the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, came to the National Assembly and start as an acting president only 2 days after the strike, no? And at that time, she had an important address to the nation, and she said, "We understand that this situation is a difficult situation, but we decide to work with this historical confrontation between the Bolivarian doctrine or our position in the Bolivarian against the Monroe Doctrine, no? And the way to do that now, and the possibility to do that now, protecting the peace of the Venezuelan people, the life of Venezuelan people, and also the peace of the region, is using the diplomatic channels to do that. And she said something that is very, very important, that during her speech, she said that the aggression is a stain on the relation between Venezuela and the United States, and indicate that the country's effort has been focused with the dignity on guaranteeing peace and the life of the Venezuelan people, but also of the entire region, as we remain commitment to the declaration of the Latin American and the Caribbean should be a zone of peace. Venezuelan government action are guided by the Bolivarian diplomacy for peace, which translate into a practice of making every effort necessary to defend the interests of our country, the Republic, and its sovereignty through diplomacy, with dignity and wisdom. But Bolivarian diplomacy for peace also means that Venezuela defends its right to develop and our commitment to continue working toward regional integration. And my final comment about this is the history and the politics is not only one moment, and it's not a straight path, no? On the contrary, there are a long and a difficult road, but we have to know that we write the history, and we have to continue working in the ideas and in the proposal because what happened with Venezuela, we have a new model. Even we have been blockade and coercive measures and all these attacks, we have been ground in economy during 19th trimester. And we are working in communities, and we are improving the cities and the community, and we are including the people in the national develop. So that means that we have to continue working in our proposal and our model as a country. And of course, we have to, it's difficult time, but the politics is not only one moment. And as sometimes Foucault said, that the politics is also the continue, is the, that was the, the politics is the continuation of the war by other means. So we understand that this historical confrontation will continue, and we are dealing with this situation now. We are doing what we have to do as a country to protect our people, and we believe, Venezuelan people believe in our leadership, and we know that the revolution is not one person. The revolution is the people of Venezuela, the people in each community, the people that is working every day to develop the country and to protect what we are doing during this time of revolution, and we will continue doing, even in difficult times. But we believe that the diplomacy and the Bolivarian diplomacy of peace will help to that.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador. I think that you've come to a natural end, which I think is a good way to kind of wrap up our first session. The aim of our first session was to give our listeners, our participants, a sense of the internal dynamic of Venezuela. And both from Leila and from you, Ambassador, we got that. We got the broad Afrocentric authenticity of the Venezuelan revolution from Leila. And from you, we got an update of the state of affairs. And of course, you ended on a note of commitment, and you gave us the assurance that the revolution still stands, despite, of course, the fact that it's going through a very difficult period. Obviously, it must be very difficult. And the demand continues for the return of the rightful president. But in the meantime, there's a legitimate government, a Chavista government, still intact. There's a recognized opposition still doing the work of the government. And so that is the picture from which we will be conducting the rest of our discussions. So that brings my session as chair to a close. I now move to Pat Daly, who would then take over for the second session. And then hopefully after that, we move to the question and answer session. But first, section 2. Thank you, Pat. Go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Leila. Thank you, Ambassador. We're now moving to a section entitled Regional Politics and Decline in Empire. And here we have two speakers. We have David Abdullah, who is a Trinidad and Tobago trade unionist, economist, and politician, and a graduate of the University of the West Indies at St. Augustine. Abdullah worked for the Oil Workers Trade Union from 1978 until his retirement in 2016, where he served as its Chief Education and Research Officer and was Secretary General of the Union from 2008 to 2016. He also served as President of the Federation of Independent Trade Unions and Non-Governmental Organizations. He's the current leader of the Movement for Social Justice, and Abdullah served as a government senator from 2010 to 2012 during the 10th Republican Parliament. He's a member of the Regional Executive Committee of the Assembly of Caribbean People. With David, we have Essam El-Khoury from the Global Pan-African Movement North American Delegation. Essam is a Libyan PhD student in the Department of Education, Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His research and work focus on the contemporary history of Libya and its education system, the impact of imperialism on global education, and the ongoing ideological projects promoted by transnational actors in the Third World. He serves as the assistant editor to the Middle East Critique, as well as on the International Advisory Board of Pambazuka News. So we'll start with David. Over to you, David. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Sister Patricia, for that introduction. As you mentioned, that I studied economics at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. That's when I first met Professor Horace Campbell. He was a young lecturer and I was a student. And in fact, Horace would remember that the day when we were announcing the candidates for the original United Labour Front in the 1976 elections in San Fernando, you went down to San Fernando with me. I was driving, and we had long conversations then, before, and afterwards. So we connect from the mid-1970s to now. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this important discussion. And thanks to those who preceded me. I want to say that we are dealing with U.S. imperialism. Of course, U.S. imperialism has been around for a long time. Its colonial agenda, reference was made to the Monroe Doctrine, which of course is more than 200 years old. But we are now dealing with US imperialism in a new era, in the era where the neoliberal capitalist model is in crisis, where it is being challenged, for example, by the rise of its hegemony. US hegemony is being challenged by the rise of China in terms of technology, the size of the economy, the development of other alliances such as the BRICS and other groups like that. And the US economy is also in crisis with its huge trillion-dollar debt, both in terms of the fiscal deficit, annual fiscal deficit, which is growing, and also in terms of the balance of trade, which is hugely negative. The US imports more than it exports. And the only way it can sustain that is, of course, by having the US dollar as the principal currency of exchange, so that capital flows continue to go into the US to help to balance its deficits. Now, in this context, the US, therefore, is seeking to control more wealth, more resources, more control over markets, and of course, the exploitation of workers. And in order to sustain its hegemonic position and also to maintain the neoliberal model within the United States. And that is why this so-called America First agenda under Trump and a very aggressive implementation of the Monroe Doctrine. I call it Monroe Doctrine on steroids. Trump calls it Monroe Doctrine, but I really don't want to give him any credit. It's really the Monroe Doctrine on steroids. And the national security strategy of the US, which was released a few months ago, is very important to understand US imperialism in this era, and its assertion that no one else, in terms of no other state, must be involved at all, either in terms of access to resources, markets, or a military presence in this hemisphere. Hence Greenland, hence the threats against Colombia, of course, Cuba, Mexico, and so on. And the attack against Venezuela and the kidnapping of President Maduro and the first combatant was part of this strategy by the United States in terms of controlling the hemisphere. So what this raises fundamentally is the issue of sovereignty. Already Venezuela has had to, and we heard the ambassador speaking to that, has had to address its own sovereignty in the context of what happened on the 3rd of January and subsequently. But it raises sovereignty for the Caribbean, throughout the hemisphere, but for of course, the Caribbean. I'm speaking now particularly. And it's ironic because Dr. Layla spoke about Simon Bolivar being supported by Petion and the Haitian Revolution. Bolivar, of course, also was supported by Trinidad, not the colonial government of Trinidad, but Bolivar's troops often retreated into Trinidad because Trinidad is so close to Venezuela, as we all know, during critical moments of the War of Liberation. And so while Trinidad was a refuge, if you wish, for the liberators fighting against the Spanish, now we have Trinidad and Tobago being a refuge for US imperialism against the Venezuelan revolution. It's a complete reversal of that historic relationship. That's just an aside. But we now have, of course, the situation where I even heard your Prime Minister Tennyson speaking recently, Prime Minister of St. Lucia, who is a progressive individual. Some people might attack him, but he's a progressive individual, having to say that St. Lucia now is being told by the United States that it can't even send students to study medicine in Cuba. And of course, some countries, Antigua, Barbuda, and one or two others, have ended the arrangement of the Cuban medical brigades working in our countries and providing critical medical support for our health services and for, therefore, our citizens. So there's that kind of intense pressure. A number of Eastern Caribbean countries have already agreed to accept deportees from the United States, from third countries. All of this is part of the intense pressure of the United States, of US imperialism on our countries, which are very small economies, very vulnerable to external shocks and so on. And of course, there's a threat of revoking visas or not issuing visas to our citizens for travel or for immigration and otherwise. So you have all of these threats, and of course, the threat of tariffs against countries like Mexico and I suppose Brazil, if they were to provide oil to Cuba, which is tightening even more the blockade, the illegal criminal blockade against Cuba. And so one of the major issues that we have to deal with in terms of the defense of sovereignty is the defense of the Cuban Revolution. Because clearly Marco Rubio wants to end the Cuban Revolution. That's part of what he sees as his historic role or whatever, coming from the community of the Gausanos in Miami. So we have to defend the Cuban Revolution. And in terms of the Pan-African dimension of this, South Africa has to step up, because South Africa, apartheid would not have ended. And Horace is the expert on African matters and history, but Angola would not have sustained its independence. Namibia would not have become independent. Mozambique would, and so on, Zimbabwe would not have achieved or maintained their independence without the Cubans' intervention and loss of lives in Southern Africa. So Southern Africa, particularly, like South Africa, they have to step up. They have to put things on the line now in defense of Cuba, because Cuba did that for them. Mexico and Brazil also have to step up, in my view. Brazil, Lula had a long historical relationship with Fidel. Fidel and Lula started the Sao Paulo Forum of the left and progressive political parties in Latin America and the Caribbean. My own party, the MSJ, is a member of the forum. And they did that before Lula came to government, before Chavez was elected and so on. So there is a need now for the progressive governments, in spite of the threats of the United States, by way of sanctions on tariffs and other things, to support and defend the Cuban Revolution. Because and the Cubans will fight to the bitter end, but if Cuba's sovereignty cannot be defended by us, then no country in Latin America and the Caribbean can claim sovereignty at this point in time. So that I wanted to make that point. Trump has torn up the post-World War II order. United Nations, as far as I'm concerned now, has become relegated to history almost. Trump has withdrawn from virtually every UN institution. It has, by attacking Venezuela military and kidnapping President Maduro and Celia Flores. Trump has said that the UN Charter doesn't apply to the United States, and so on, doesn't care about it. By imposing unilateral tariffs on countries, he has torn up the World Trade Organization, which was not a fair rules-based order for the countries of the Global South. We have to say that because we oppose those arrangements, but Trump has torn it up, and so on. Even Carney has said that order has been ruptured. So in this context, therefore, what will emerge? Here in the Caribbean, I'm very concerned that there is the reemergence of, and Tennyson, you would remember this, and if Ralph comes in, he would also know this intimately, the return of the Caribbean Democratic Union, which was a grouping of right-wing political parties prior to, well, during the Grenadian Revolution and then subsequent to the destruction of the revolution. So Jamaica Labour Party, Tom Adams' party at the time, Eugenia Charles and others formed the Caribbean Democratic Union, which was a response to the left and progressive political parties in the region. And we're beginning to see a reemergence of that with Chastanet, Kamala Prasad-Bissessar and others. The election in Barbados next week is going to be of interest because no doubt, Mia Mottley has taken a position as well. And it was interesting that at the inauguration of the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, his swearing in for a second term, that the Prime Ministers who attended came from Barbados, Dominica, St. Kitts, and Ralph was also present. So that's an indication of the kind of divisions. And therefore, one of the problems is that CARICOM is in serious danger as a regional integration process. And that weakens our capacity to defend whatever limited sovereignty we may have. Lastly, just very quickly, we have to begin to address, and we can't address it now, what is going to emerge in this period of the continuing collapse of the empire, but the empire is still very powerful and therefore very dangerous. What is going to emerge globally? Is it going to be throughout the world a strengthening of fascism and neo-fascism as more governments of or more parties of the right get elected or take power in one way or the other, not just in Latin America and the Caribbean, but in Europe and parts of Africa? Or will we see progressive parties and movements and social movements gaining strength as they recognize the threat of this new of imperialism in this age, and therefore organize and the resistance becomes even more powerful, and so on. This is a critical moment in world history, and we have a lot of work to do in political education, first of all, because we have to educate. So I congratulate Pambazuka for the work that you are doing, and also through the education, mobilization, and through the mobilization, organizing popular movements, strengthening movements, political parties to challenge the status quo, to challenge for power, and bring about another world, because it is not only necessary, but it is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for this reminder that what happened in Venezuela is not only a matter for Venezuelans. It has repercussions for regional unity, for Cuba, and I think it's also important that you call on those countries that Cuba has assisted to ensure their liberation, that they should now step up, and support Cuba. And, they're obviously real threats to the Caribbean. So thank you for pushing us to think about how we will mobilize in this new phase of imperialism. We're now going to turn to Isam, who will carry on the theme. Isam.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces and the new faces, despite that the unfortunate circumstances. And I think they're not just out of fortune, it's out of orchestration by imperialist power to do what they're doing towards Venezuela particularly, but also much of the global South. So I am a bit of a visual learner. So also, when I like to present, I like to always show slides for people to follow the certain things I'll be saying, and also developing a little bit more what the comrades have mentioned, all of them, from Leila to Marta and lastly Abdul. The overview, what I'll be briefly speaking about, is that the role of Venezuela to us and people in the global South is tremendous, and no amount of town halls that one can hear can really explicate that. But I will give a few examples of how they have been meaningful to the global South, and not just in terms of performative diplomacy, but actually material benefits to the people. And then how does imperialism integrate itself into these projects and dismantle them from within? And lastly, thinking about what is the larger meaning of this attack on Venezuela and the kidnapping of the president and his wife. What do they mean at this political conjuncture? So the brief note that I have usually about imperialism is that Samir Amin, the late political economist, has this notion that imperialism walks on two legs, right? The financial one, the economic, and then there's also the military. And then most of his writings, he alludes to the role of propaganda and ideology, how it makes those two legs move. Venezuelan Bolivarian revolution, when it commenced, in the late 90s, it tried to target those three aspects. by creating an independent media outlet that is, when you say independent, it means that it's independent from imperialist talking points. So the creation of Telesur, this channel that has been blocked, I think, after 2022 because of its views on the Russia-Ukraine war, it has been a very weighty media for Latin America, but then also in a number of languages that they produce content in. And they've also tried to counteract and create an alternative financial model or financial system to transact within Latin America through the alliance of the Bolivarian people, which is the ALBA. And then lastly, they have been having joint trainings with aligned countries such as Cuba. Now, what the imperialist powers they tend to do is that they have the BBC and CNN and so forth. So you look at how imperialism works and they try to combat it with the same way. Because if a country is strong financially, not strong militarily, they cannot compete with imperialism. So one has to be equally creative and aggressive in how they defend their sovereignty. So they have created joint military training with, for example, Cuba. And Mark Rubio comes out and says that these trainings are just Cuban thugs. They're a bunch of mercenaries. But then when NATO does their trainings, it's a military with military, right? So that's kind of the construction of the imperialist system. How anything that evolves out of this orbit, they try to frame it as something that is thuggish. But so there's this NATO, which has a tremendous history of onslaught on many countries in the global south. And if you are an avid reader, and I encourage you to be an avid reader of Pambazuka News, we had a special issue on it back in April, where we talked about how NATO is disintegrating from within. So there's that. And then we also talked about its history of imperialist interventions. A couple of years ago, before NATO intervention in Libya in 2011, there was a movement in Latin America and Africa under the leadership of Hugo Chavez and Muammar Gaddafi, is to create an equivalent to it, which is the South Atlantic Treaty Organization. And in 2009, when they had the summit, they said that by 2012, they're going to start having trainings and formalize that. And we know what happened in 2011. When NATO attacked Libya and so forth. And so also remember that all of these attack on single countries, they tend to create disunity amongst them. And I'm so glad that people brought up the case of Cuba, because for much of the liberation movements in Southwestern Africa and Southeastern Africa and Southern Africa, is that Cuba played a big role. And I highly encourage people to read this book, which is just about Cubans in Angola, but it's the larger meaning of it. It's what does it mean to have Cubans dedicating their lives, bodies, limbs, and minimal sources that they have to the Angolan revolution and liberation movement, and then also how do they help to construct national sovereignty and independence. So Cuba is a terrorist state, Venezuela is a terrorist state. Any country that tries to compete with imperialism and white supremacy is framed as such. So this is why they try to right now strangle Venezuela, so they further strangle Cuba and cause a fissure between them, right? So, but this policy did not start with Trump point one or Trump point two or Biden. It started with an Afro-American president, right? So, and even not even start with him, but he is the one to constitute an aggressive policy against the Venezuelan/Bolivarian revolution. So in 2015, signs the fact sheet. If you look, it's President Barack Obama issued a new executive order declaring a national emergency with respect to the unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States posed by the situation in Venezuela. So since 2015, there have been a full-fledged economic, propaganda, and military warfare trying to coup and assassinate Nicolas Maduro. And before him, they obviously tried to also coup Hugo Chavez. And then sanctions, if one of the things that I volunteer and do is the International People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism with a lot of comrades from Venezuela. There is a hearing, if you were interested in learning more about it, particularly Venezuela. It's roughly 5 hours long, so you can listen to it while doing dishes or laundry or whatever in the background. But it details of how the sanctions work and how do they work for U.S. imperialism works against the people where they're being sanctioned, such as medicine, flying tickets, financial transactions, everything that one could need to survive is being blockaded only to defame the government that is ruling. And there are plenty of hearings that one can hear about Zimbabwe, Korea, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, and so forth. You can find them on YouTube. But I'm glad that Leila spoke about how propaganda works, particularly to now the notion of this de-Africanization of Venezuela. And given that there is a large population in Venezuela, well, they don't necessarily consider themselves Afro-Venezuela, but based on the statistics as you showed. So this is what right now, when we were developing this program, I spoke with Walimo and Tennyson about the necessity of speaking who are the enemies of such a revolution that is actually redistributes wealth and tries to create a socialist project. There are usually elements that are against the working class. So, and this is the imperialist propaganda. This is Venezuelans themselves creating this, but also gets regurgitated and platformed on global North white supremacists. So we know that the Bolivarian revolution, or the Chavistas particularly, they tend to wear this red hat that Hugo Chavez tend to used to wear. And so on the left, they have like new order of species, and then one of them is a mutant of the Partido Único. And then there always the display that those who want socialism are welfare queens. They don't work. And so the one in the middle is like people who like Chavez are like dogs. They stay at home. We have been promised a house and they have achieved it. So you're just servile, docile. You don't do anything. So you're a welfare queen. Not even a queen, just a dog actually here, right? And then lastly, in the celebration of the 10 years of the Bolivarian Revolution, they portray Afro-Venezuelans as monkeys, and goes on, right? So diverse thoughts, being Venezuelan, you have no diversity in thoughts, you're being Chavista. And then lastly, Chavistas as a new form of piranhas, which is the type of fish that is very aggressive and eats meat and and attacks flesh. And so this is, and you notice that a lot of people in Venezuela, especially in larger cities, they tend to ride more motorcycles, and the motorcycles, they are associated with the Chavistas, a lot of them. And I'll return to that point later on. So this is how they portray anybody who is pro-Bolivarian revolution as they're Afro, that they're not Venezuelan, they're not, they leech on the system, they attack it, they kill it from within. So now, from Libya to Venezuela, there's a political economy beyond this that is just, it's not about racism as this interpersonal disputes of hatred of Black people or people of color generally. It has usually, and not usually, I think more often than we tend to speak about it, beyond this convivial atmosphere, there's a political and economic implications of such, right? So in Libya, remember that these are the enemies of unity. So Libya was spearheading the African Union project of creating an alternative currency, creating unity from South-South. And then you had protesters who go out against the government, and they have posted these signs. They carried the American flag, sounds like Maria Machado, went and asked for Hillary Clinton, John McCain to visit Eastern Libya and so forth. And they carried signs, you have a new ally in North Africa. And then this is the propaganda part, and then there's the intellectual part, which is there are people who work as functionaries of US imperialism in the academy. And so they write books like this one. So you have a Libyan diaspora, it's right, carrying the Libyan monarchy flag in front of the White House, in front of the heart of the empire, right, the White House. And then they use the favorite word, authoritarian regime. They never use the word government. And this Dana Moss got an award for this book by the American Sociological Association, which sees how empire, military, knowledge production, they all work together cohesively to get awarded for being in service of the status quo. Now, I have a few images, and I'll show you how this de-Africanization process works. Is that because Libya, they're trying to pretend that, oh, Libya is an Arab country, most people look like me, they're not really darker skin. So the rebels, or in Eastern Libya, they started to attack particularly Black Libyans. So, and some of these images are ruthless. And so one of them was Hisham Shushan in 2011, was attacked his Libyan, just like myself. They attacked him because allegedly he's an African mercenary trying to steal Libyan resources or being a welfare person and Libya's oil. So he was lynched in public. And Western mass media did not even speak about it. And if they did, they called him a mercenary. So an African mercenary, as if he's not Libyan. So they lynch him as such. In Venezuela, there is also the Orlando figure, who I know Leila also mentioned, and he is Afro-Venezuelan. And again, this image is ruthless, but I just to visualize the brutality that tends to happen is that he was stabbed 6 times, and then he was put gasoline on him, and they burned him. So in the book by Justin Pudor and Joe Emersberger, they talk about Figueroa's murder was not only gruesome, it was revealing in many ways that were ignored. On May 20, Figueroa was stabbed 6 times, doused with gasoline, and set on fire by protesters in the wealthy Altamira neighborhood, which is an opposition stronghold of Chacao, a municipality in East Caracas. Obviously, what does Western mass media say? They say, man set ablaze. They don't talk about like by whom. Just like when children in Palestine are being genocided by the Israeli occupation forces, they don't say they are killed by, they say died. And then when they want to delegitimize the narrative, they say the government says Figueroa was targeted for being a Chavista. So this attack on Afro-Venezuelans and so forth is intentional to actually say, oh, these Afro-Venezuelans, they're leeching on our resources and so forth. And this also was very violent protests in 2017 elections and also in former and following elections. They tend to erupt and they start killing people in a very targeted way. If you recall, when I talked about the new Perenjas, those who leech and so forth, and they tend to they portray the Chavistas as they ride motorcycles all the time. So when they're going into the guarimbas or the barricades where there's neighborhoods of wealthy people, they put barbed wire strung along a thoroughfare by these anti-government protesters who are anti-Chavista, so that motorcycles, their heads get decapitated, some of them. So this is the violence that the enemies of unity, enemies of the Bolivarian revolution tend to do within. And these are the proponents, these are the people who are proponents of Maria Machado, these are the proponents of NATO in Libya. They do this kind of atrocious acts. But given this developments, from obviously I don't have intel from what's going within, particularly the diplomacy of the Venezuelan government. I'm glad that the ambassador Marca is here with us, but I want to highlight this larger dimension of this this attack and kidnapping on Venezuela. So, from my comrades in Venezuela, that there are daily protests in defense of the Bolivarian revolution and the necessity of bringing back the president and his wife, but also for the current, the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, or acting president, to maintain the path of the Bolivarian revolution. So this kidnapping is taking place, but then also the piracy of the oil and the complicity of Qatar. I want to remind that Qatar is not an anti-imperialist state. It hosts only place for negotiation of the Taliban in the US and the Palestinian resistance forces and the US in Qatar, but it is not an anti-imperialist country. Remember, they played a fundamental role in the destruction of Libya to give it an Islamic and Arabic legitimacy. If NATO comes and attacks Libya, it's a Western Euro countries coming and attacking Libya, but when you have Qatar and UAE coming together and bombing Libya, it sounds like, oh, it's an Arab, it's collective, it's world consciousness. And then there is this anti-multipolarity and an impending attack on Iran. We all know that Iran is also going to be bombed next shortly. But we also need to understand that the fact when a country is sanctioned, like Venezuela, like Iran, and like Cuba, they have no way to transact with the rest of the world. So what do? They transact and do economic cooperation with one another. Eventually, how do they get framed by Western mass media of these survivalist tools? This is a coalition of terrorist states. They don't say states, they say regimes. And so now Venezuelan oil, they have been refined by actually Iranian experts for a couple of years. And then they say Iran is giving a lifeline to Venezuela. So both are terrorist states and they both are supporting one another. And so this is why we need to have a military attack. And the final technique is that given the success and the continuation of the Bolivarian revolution, they are aiming to start to foment division within their movement. So you will start seeing in the next couple of days, or even like 10 days ago, The Guardian published no sources mentioned. They said that Delcy already agreed that to coup Maduro, according to sources that cannot be named. And then they go on and named, unnamed, unnamed. So what do they try to show? Given the fact that they see that the Bolivarian revolution persists, the people are still united, they want to create this unity by propagating these talking points. And so from Libya to Venezuela, I send you much solidarity and strength to the comrades in Venezuela and everywhere. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Issam, for that was a very formidable presentation. And I think it's really important that you remind us of the revolutionary potential of African people, because it's that potential wherever it is that imperialist forces have been trying to squash. And it reminds us that we need to be in solidarity, that all global African people and allies need to be in solidarity wherever we are in the world. But I'm sure there are lots of questions from our audience, and I'm going to pass over to Tennyson to lead the Q&A.
Thank you, Pat, and I want to congratulate all our presenters for what has turned out to be so far an excellent discussion. Our aim was to bring issues to the fore to allow us as a community to understand better what is happening in Venezuela. And I think so far, our speakers all have done an excellent job, and I want to give them all a round of applause and to thank them for their time. We're still a bit hopeful, waiting for Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves to show, but we're not going to be definitive about it, but we're still trying to see if we can get him to come. But in the meantime, I think we have enough for us to chew on. And so a very simple process, simply show your hands. I call on our managers. If you see anybody that I am not able to pick up, just feel free to intervene and let me know that somebody's hand is up. And we'll acknowledge you as you show your hand. And Therese is on standby to assist anybody with Spanish, to assist us with the translation. So if anybody prefers to make their presentation or ask the question in Spanish, they can feel free to do so. Pat, you're saying something?
Yes, and people can also write their questions in the chat, especially if you're watching on YouTube.
Yes.
We have somebody who will repeat them to the speakers.
Saludos a todos. Mi función hoy aquí es proporcionar traducciones al español para nuestros hablantes de español. Si se sienten más cómodos hablando en español, no duden en hacer sus preguntas en ese idioma. Con gusto les ayudaré con la traducción.
So the floor is open. Well, since so far nobody has asked any questions, perhaps I can use my position as co-chair to kind of spark a discussion. I wanted to ask Brother David in particular to just give us some reflections on what strategies can we adopt in light of the fact that what we are seeing, and I just want to describe it very briefly, is a very kind of what I call a narrow and a kind of cheap way imperialism is behaving in the present. So the examples you gave in your presentation, for example, where we've been told that where a prime minister is reporting that he is being told that students who get the normal scholarships to Cuba, and that is now being frowned upon by the U.S. government. So in the past, we would see imperialism behaving in a general and broad way. But in the current iteration of imperialism, particularly in relation to the weaker countries in the Caribbean, because of their support for the Venezuelan revolution, and because the US is now trying to stamp any possibility of alternative, we're seeing things like the example you gave us, scholarships for students who would not have had another chance of getting a means to study medicine. They're now being told directly that the US is looking at it at that narrow level. And the last example, of course, has to do with the visa bans, So something which is natural travel of people between regions that is now being used as a sort of Damocles over the heads of regional governments who normally would not be imposed upon in that what I call a narrow and cheap way, for want of a better expression. What do you propose for us at the ground level in terms of a strategy to combat that? Because we know our states will kowtow and would kind of give in to those demands. What do you propose for us as grassroots social movements to assist our governments to respond to those threats?
Yeah, thanks for that, Tennyson. One of the things that we are trying to do at this moment is to strengthen processes of integration at the grassroots level and strengthen those processes. There were powerful social movements in the region, I would say up until the early 90s, mid-90s, when the trade union movement was quite strong, Trinidad and Tobago and so on. And then, you had regional NGOs and national NGOs, but they were not narrowly defined, well, they were not narrowly functioning as NGOs. They were doing popular education around matters of structural adjustment, IMF, debt, and empowering people through popular education. Those types of activities have come to an end, more or less. A lot of those groups have gone out. Some of the key people in leadership have gotten older, not active anymore. And then the funding for those organizations either dried up or they shifted emphasis to micro projects. And so the social movements are very weak in the Caribbean. And this is a moment now where we can begin to rebuild, if you wish, a sense of social movement. So even in Trinidad and Tobago, I mean, not that I stopped understanding imperialism at all, but to use the term imperialism, a lot of people may not have connected to it. They would have said, that sounds like, David and his long time ideas from way back when. Those things are outdated. But when people in Trinidad and Tobago and throughout the region can now see US military destroyers in Trinidad, they see a radar located by the US, they see the statements made by the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago in support of the killing of extrajudicial killing, which is murder of our people, of citizens of Trinidad and Tobago and other citizens of Venezuela, Colombia, and so on by the US. People are now beginning to understand this in their real life experience, lived experiences. So it gives us the opportunity for progressive forces now to engage in a lot of political education. We have to seize the moment and engage in political education and now seek to rebuild movement. And certainly the Assembly of Caribbean People has taken a bit of a new lease of life. We have a lot of follow-up work on consolidation to do. But I think that is essential if the governments that are trying to hold a progressive position, at least a nationalist position in defense of independence and sovereignty, feel that they're being supported on the ground. And that we expose those governments that have some of them become lackeys of US imperialism. The government of Trinidad and Tobago is a lackey of US imperialism. We have to call that out. But the capacity of CARICOM, I think, to defend is very, very weak, unfortunately, right now.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, comrade. Any other questions?
We have a question from the Embassy of Venezuela to Barbados.
Go ahead, Marta.
Yeah, it's a comment. I want to, in the case of Venezuela, and I think that in the case of the region, when we talk about integration and is the role, of course, of the social movement and what David Dula from Trinidad and Tobago is playing is very important, because now the role of the social movement in not only in the region, in the world, is to tell to the people of each country what so many governments are not available to say or don't want to say. So the social movements are very important now, and it's very important to understand that the integration and unity is not only inside each country. In the case of the Bolivarian Revolution, unity is a key of what is happening in Venezuela, because when the last address of the President Chavez, he said that we have to keep together unity, struggle, battle, and victory, you know? So unity is a key between the region and in the world, not only in the social movement, and also we need to understand, and I think that is another important key in Venezuela, the state and the nation and the development of the nation require state and government with commitment with their own land and also with the region, because the only way to resist this aggression that is around the world. It's not only, as some of you explained, it's not only against Venezuela, because the question is also who is next. And the next is not necessary country that is against the imperialism, because as Kissinger say could be bad to be a enemy or adversary of the imperialism of the United States, but could be worse if you are allies to the United States, because well, we have to work in diplomacy. We have to, there are difficult times. We have to do the best that we can, but we have to consider that we need leaderships in the world, not only in the region, in the world, with commitment with the human beings that understand that the silent is contribute with what is happening. The example that we had in Palestine, and also the example that we have in different situations these days, and also in the case of Venezuela, is that the imperialism also worked to divide the region, to divide the governments, to divide, because only without unity they can advance faster than if we keep together. And I think that because the history is no one moment, we need to work together to rebuild the unity of the region, the social movement, and as the colleague that speak before, the global south of what the role that we are in the state and in the governments and in the social movement. But we need to work in that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Any comments?
I wanted to just ask Issam to maybe talk a little bit more. I mean, he briefly kind of mentioned the People's Tribunals, but I just wanted to hear him maybe talk a little bit more about, the work of the People's Tribunals and why, in this moment, it's important for us to have these processes where we're documenting what we understand to be, the wrongs that we are witnessing, not just for people at the level of the government. So I wanted to hear Issam talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, thanks for this question. So the People's Tribunal started as an independent scholars project, and people from different countries a lot of us were, for some reason, were all of us in the US, and we have met through this Middle East Critique journal that I assist in editing. And we producing literature that was very anti-imperialist. And then people said, we need to create a movement that talks actually about how one person's article, he tied the sanctions on Libya to the sanctions on Venezuela, and his name is Mateo Capasso, great comrade and friend of mine. And so people started to read that article and seeing how sanctions as a logic is meant to deindustrialize and kill the ability of a nation to create sovereign economic development. So they said, but it's not just about building factories and that's it. There's something bigger. So it's a group of scholars who are tied to local movements from different countries. So any country that you saw on the list, we have different people who used to be former health ministers, like in the case of Libya that I interviewed to get data about how the sanctions impacted the health sector. He connected me to the Minister of Education in Libya formerly. And then, so it was mostly people who understand that sanctions were also an ideological project. What I mean by that is that right now, when you go and talk about Venezuela, just in mainstream media, they would say the economy is weak. You talk about Iran, they say the economy, look at the inflation. You talk about Libya pre-2011 and pre-sanctions removal on Libya, temporary sanctions that were lifted, they would say that the economy is weak. And they say because of the leadership. So the logic behind it is that whenever there's a socialist government or a socialist project, sanctions, they tend to impede that. And so sanctions have an ideological function to be against governments themselves and against socialist projects. They don't talk about how a country like Yugoslavia was destroyed first through sanctions and then through NATO bombing. The same with Libya and so forth. So that is the project. And we work closely also with the People's Forum, which was based in New York City, to be the place where we started the hearings, and then we ended the closing plenary. But it's an independent scholars, and we have George Soros is not funding us or anything like that. So yeah, so that's or any government. It's people tied. And then also to understand there are people who are from Libya that were impacted by sanctions, and I told them, hey, can you please get on the panel and speak about your experience? They said no, because I'm actually in favor of sanctions. So it just shows that there are people within my country, and I'm sure in Iran who are pro-sanctions, in Cuba who are pro-sanctions. It's very ideological position to be anti-sanctions, I think, too. It's not just about human rights and so forth. So thanks.
Thank you, Isan, for stressing the internal class dimensions of these questions, because although we're dealing with imperialism as an external force, it knows how to play the internal class dynamics. That's why you will get some people, although you might be from the country, supporting the sanctions because you have a class position on it. We have a question from Zofia, and I think she's asking a question more linked to the international relations side of our revolution. Her question is basically, she's asking us and she's asking our panelists to take a stab at the question of the relationship between the Bolivarian revolution and its Pan-Africanism and major powerful counter-hegemonic states, if you want to call them that, like China and Russia and Russia. So she's saying that today, although China is one of the most overtly competitive states to the United States in terms of its global hegemonic power, China's role in defending the revolution and even Russia's role to a certain extent has not been as explicit and as clear-cut as one would have thought should have been the outcome. So she's asking us to reflect on that, and she wants to know how should we think about that question, about our assumption that we are locked in a kind of global South struggle and we would get natural support from other anti-imperialist, counter-hegemonic states, but so far, in terms of its overt expression, we have not seen that. So that is what Zofia is asking, and I think it's a question that is on all of our minds in relation to how much support these revolutions get from the states which can in fact, and which are in fact in a position to give direct support. But so far we have not seen it as explicitly as we think it might have been given. And it's open to any member of the panel.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'll take an initial stab at it, Tennyson, if I can. It's a very crucial question, and in the aftermath of January 3rd, many people were asking, what went on. There were all kinds of speculations and so on. Now, the issue really, I mean, clearly there was and continues to be material engagement, for example, in terms of Cuba's energy crisis. China has established huge solar farms, right, to generate electricity via solar energy. And there are other other agreements of cooperation. There were agreements between China and Russia and Venezuela in terms of economic and other kinds of agreements, right? The issue really now is in the context of US imperialism, saying we are going to do whatever we want militarily, it then raises the issue of how do other countries, in particular China in this case, respond to that in this hemisphere, where they do not have any military presence. Remember, the United States has many, many military bases throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, in Colombia, Panama, and elsewhere, Puerto Rico, and so on, which is a colony of the United States. How does China respond to that? Is there a possible deterrent militarily? Now, the story is different, of course, in Asia. North Korea has a nuclear deterrent, and that will make the US think twice about what it wants to do in terms of attacking North Korea. That is why they were so adamant on Israel to attack Iran, and they still want to attack Iran. So that Iran is going to be, in the next few days and weeks, a critical determinant again of counter-US hegemonic power. Militarily, I'm talking about now. So even though there may be economic agreements and arrangements, the issue is really around the military engagement. That's as far as I want to go on that. I certainly think that China has to do a lot more, as I call out South Africa. I call out countries of the global south, and Brazil and Mexico because of the hemispheric relationship, and South Africa because of the historic relationship. But certainly China is going to have to do a lot more to support Cuba at this moment. It already is, but it's going to have to do a lot more to support Cuba at this moment. And I will stop there. Others can add and subtract or go much further than I have ventured or dared to suggest.
I mean, I don't have a lot to say about it, but it is something that I think about just in terms of like as it's a function of the way China does international intervention, which is typically economically, and which is why it actually does matter so much that, when we think about Venezuela and the attempt to arm, basically a people's militia, and really the kind of important questions that I think are also being asked of the Sahel states about like what does it mean to have to transition between a a military coup that brings a progressive government to power, and then to actually transition into what it means to govern by and for the people. And China, I think is interesting even in the Venezuelan context, because I remember when I was doing field work in Venezuela, so many of the grocery stores were owned by Chinese immigrants in the population. And so I'm even just thinking about the kind of ongoing, the long-standing economic relationships, but in particular for us, for me, I think as Pan-African is really thinking about what it means to look to places that are attempting to build military infrastructure, because defense really is important in our ability to sort of maintain our political autonomy and sovereignty, and that just doesn't seem to be the way China is intervening.
Okay, any other attempt to respond to this? Isam, I saw your hand. I saw Pat's hand as well.
Yes.
Isam, we'll go with Venezuela. We can go with go in this order. Isam, Marta, and then Pat. Okay.
Yes. I think just sometimes when we're thinking of these particular powers that are fighting US imperialism, that we think that they will be using the exact same tools of US imperialism when they're going to be not combating US imperialism. So, for example, false flag operations, espionage, false bombings, killing of protesters like we saw in Iran with the Mossad, what they did in a recent protest. We expect that global South countries are fighting imperialism going to be doing the same thing. And I think the ideas of non-intervention and territorial sovereignty means that countries such as Russia and China, despite their massive power, military and economic, they will not be doing imperialism the same like imperialism as we understand it, this style of the United States, meaning that they're going to go send their ships and defend Venezuela or any country that they're aligned with. They even in, I think, 2021, they created the group of Friends of the United Nations Charter, and this is the idea that the policy of non-intervention and so forth, we should be friends of the Charter of the United States, where almost 200 countries agree on, as opposed to fighting belligerents with belligerents, fighting imperialist onslaught with equal imperialist onslaught. And I think this is the difference, where people sometimes expecting the same playbook that's used by US imperialism as allies to be used by Russia and China in defending countries and so forth. And so I think that sometimes that question tends to equate them as equally bad powers, which I think we should think of it more dialectically, of how they have developed as strong economic and military powers, and how they are trying to go against this current of US imperialism and its aggression. Yeah, so those are kind of my thoughts on Russia and China.
Good, very good. And Ambassador, and then Pat, and I see Horace has his hand up.
No, I want to add, in the case of the, well, as we have been talking, that the international law and the international system, how we know until now, doesn't exist anymore. We are almost, I know you follow all the news, but we know that the United Nations doesn't work. The international law is not respected by the countries that have the power to do what they want. The sovereignty is keep the sovereignty for every country, not only for Venezuela, for every country with military attack as us, or without military attack, is difficult now. What we have to, in my point of view, what we have to understand, the new war have to born. New rules we need new rules. That new rules have to be making. Of course, powerful countries have a main role in this, but we have a role to play. And we have to think about how we can play that role, not only as a country, as a people in the world, because the international system is not working anymore. And we are expecting for example, as Sam explained, we have expecting answers for other countries that we didn't see. But if you see, for example, in the case of sanctions or coercive measures, that countries are working in other possibilities to move money, to use different different currency. So the answer of this situation is not necessarily what we are expecting, because we are expecting what has been seen during the history. And the situation is now we have I know the history can repeat, we know that, but we have now different situations. And the answer, because if we talk, for example, in the case of the coercive measure, I think that important question is the consequence to the imperialism, to that coercive measures. No, because it's a question that we have to, because we only answer about the consequence in the case of Venezuela, against Venezuela or against Cuba or against different countries. But the issue now for them is that all that measures have consequence to the imperialism. So we have I think that we have to move what we are thinking, what we are asking to ourselves, to find the answers that we need to do changes in the world. Is why I want to.
Excellent. Ambassador, just to let our participants know, I've seen your questions. Commissioner Tumbu and Walter, but we will go through with Pat and then Walter, and I'll come to the questions that were posted in the chat.
Oh, okay. I was about to ask the question that was put in the chat because it was sent to me.
Okay.
So I'll pass on to Mwalimu and then yeah, but we are slightly over time, so I suspect some of our audience will be leaving. So let's Mwalimu.
I will defer to the questions because I didn't have a question. I wanted to make a comment.
Okay.
So I will defer to the questions.
I think we will reserve the closing remarks for you, Mwalimu.
No. I just want a comment.
Okay.
I won't have the closing. I just want to comment. Go ahead.
Let me just deal with the questions in the chat. First of all, I think Walter's question was answered. He was asking about the role of China and Russia. So that question was answered already. But Tumbu was asking about the question of, it's a very interesting question about the Bolivarian revolution reasserting its sovereign control over oil, over its resources through South-South cooperation. So the question is asking for maybe what he's really getting at is if we can get an update in relation to how Venezuela is dealing with the question of controlling its natural resources, its oil and other resources, in the context of the current aggression. So how is the Bolivarian Revolution of Venezuela reasserting its sovereign control over oil resources and its support for South-South cooperation, in contrast to the current imperialist strategy of U.S. corporations such as ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips and the U.S. state in general? So perhaps, Ambassador, that might be a question.
Well, I can have some comments. It's not an official position, it's my comment as this discussion always as a teacher and an academic person. In the case of sovereignty, as you know, we have a difficult situation in this moment. It's only 1 month after the strike against our country. You have to consider that after that we are the revolution and the government of the Bolivarian revolution are still in the power. And that is the first step, okay? Because for sure, the defense of our sovereignty is not the same as we are in the power that Maria Corina Machado and other people that don't have any support of the people of Venezuela, inside Venezuela, if they are in the power. So we recently we approved a new law about oil industry and that law have something interesting because there are a lot of things that we wanted to do it because after the coercive measure is a lot of impact in the oil industry. And we need to do some changes to improve the oil industry in the context of the coercive measure. But if you analyze with details what is happening, and as I commented last time when we met, if you check the meeting, for example, of the oil company, what they say, we need because before the coercive measure and the sanction, Venezuela have commercial relationship with oil companies in US, in different oil companies in US. Venezuela never, who stopped the commercial relationship between Venezuela and United States was United States, no Venezuela. It's the first thing that everybody has to know. So now, after all this situation, and as you know, Chevron has been working all this time in Venezuela. We have another international companies from different countries working in Venezuela. And when the law was approved last week, the approval was by consensus for all the parliament, and all the parties in Venezuela approved the law. But in our constitution, the resource of oil and everything that is in our land is the property is of the state. So, and that didn't change. What changed is how can we work with the companies, because oil industry is very complex, and it's different if you have if you work in different kind of oil in different part of the country and produce one barrel have different costs. It depends where and what kind of oil are you producing. So what we work in the law is to understand that is happening, to understand that we still have coercive measures. That is important that you understand that, and how we can work to get better performance in the oil company and for the country. And the other thing that we have to understand it's very important to know that the speakers from the United States are not the speaker from Venezuela reality. And we have to understand that, because if we see the news, and you can see a lot of things in the news, you can hear about Venezuela since the point of view of United States, a lot of things. But what is important, that is my invitation for all of you, you have to see and check what Venezuelan government is explain, what Venezuelan government, because we are still in the government, because we have the control of our country, we have the control of our borders, we have the institution working in the country. And is a very important victory after the strike, because the first thing that everybody believed that the country was running in a chaos, that next day, I don't know, the people that imperialism decide to come to the country to be in charge, and that didn't happen. And I think that is a very good. Even they kidnapping our president, and our president, remember that our president and his wife are kidnapping in the United States. Even that, we are still in the government, we are working with the people, we are doing what we have to do to protect the people, and our acting president is working in that way. So please believe, or at least hear what we say, because if you hear what the President Trump or the authorities of the United States said about Venezuela, is for sure that's not true. No, because they are still against the revolution, and they are still saying a lot of things that are not true. And we are protecting, and I know the acting president, that is a very smart person, a very revolutionary person, and has been the Ministry of Energy and Petroleum and in charge of all that in the country the last time, and she knows what we have to do in that area. And in our constitution, the control of the resources and oil and all the resources that are in the land are for the state, are not for private. But we have to work, and we have doing business as we did before. Because if you hear what the Halliburton said to President Trump is, we have been in Venezuela, or we stay in Venezuela until the sanctions tell us that we have to leave the country. But what is the position, and always has been the position of the government of Venezuela? We have the right to do business with everybody. And we are doing business with a lot of countries in the world. And this is a struggle of every day. It's not something because I received some calls and everybody want an answer now what is happening in detail. We have 1 month after a strike, and we are still with our institution working with everything, and we are dealing with that, and I know the acting president, and our leadership will protect the sovereignty of the country and the interest of the people of Venezuela.
Okay, Ambassador, it's now 2 o'clock. Well, from where I am, Pat is very anxious that we bring it to a close. What I want to propose is just to remind you the ambassador's words that imperialism lies, okay? Don't listen to the lies of imperialism. That might be an important watchword to guard us when we listen to things and hear things and see things. Mwalimu, I think what we can do, and Pat, if you agree, we will let Mwalimu make his comment, and perhaps Pat, you can probably give the closing remarks to bring it to a close. Okay, go ahead, Mwalimu.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to say the joy I have in hearing the affirmation of the centrality of social movements. David Abdallah mentioned that he was running for the constituency of St. Augustine 50 years ago, and he was running in the parliament, and he's been consistent over 50 years. But I want to remind David that the points that he's making about political education, mobilization, and organization is so central that, as James says, that revolution comes like a thief in the night. You never know when things will break out, as they broke out of a social movement in Grenada called the New Jewel Movement. We don't know what is going to break out in the Caribbean. So the points you've made, David, today about the political education and the necessity for political education and mobilization, and that optimism that you brought today across was so important. Now, the other point that I think we should underscore is what has been said by David Abdallah about the kind of internationalism that must go on with these social movements, that we must remind our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, in all parts of the world, of the centrality of the Cuban sacrifice for the freedom of the peoples of Africa, all of Africa, because many changes that came in Africa at the end of apartheid would not have come about without the defeat of the imperialist forces at Putucona Valley. And so this kind of memory about the victories that took place should tell us something about what is possible after 35 years of defeating apartheid in Angola. And we remember, as Isam has reminded us, that is 15 years since we've had the destruction in Libya. But the destruction in Libya was not only a destruction of the productive capacity of the society and a division of the society, but to try to isolate the African population within Libya. And that as Pan-Africanists, as progressive people, we should not fall into the trap that they put us in. So the question of Libya reminds us of what happened in Abyssinia in 1935 and how that precipitated war and revolution and fascism in Europe. So the point that David Abdallah made and Isam is making, we must link with social movements in Africa, especially South Africa and Namibia. We have to call on those social movements. But the last point I want to make is the importance of social movements in the United States also. There is a major social movement that is anti-imperialist in the United States. And that anti-imperialist and anti-fascist movement in the United States, we have to do the kind of political education that brings this into the ranks of the military, to link the fight against the ICE forces, bring the fight against the forces of Wall Street into the United States military, because we know the military is not crazy about a war against Iran. But the forces of Zionism is pushing the administration to war against Iran. And so the social forces in North America, in Canada, and in Europe must join with the social forces in the third world. So the point that I want to stress is that the Pan-Africanists should not yield the discussion about what changes are going to happen in the world, because in Africa, every institution in Africa is being affected by the recklessness of imperialism. This week, the African Import Export Bank has been put under the I wouldn't use the word sanction, that's not the proper word, but the Fitch rating agency put them under a junk status. That means the African capitalist class now are being told that if you use your gold to help your people, as the government of Ghana has done, your status in the international financial markets is going to be junk status. So the African bourgeoisie is on the defensive. They cannot provide any leadership at this present moment. So our work in progressive Pan-African movement becomes even more important. So I want to thank all of the speakers for what they've done, because this political education work is to hold the line against any kind of pessimism. Will the United States imperialism defeat the Cuban Revolution before the collapse of the imperial front in NATO? That's a struggle that has to be decided by social movements. It's not going to be decided by the pundits in the media. Social movements have to play a role in the decisive struggle that's ahead of us.
Thank you, Malimo, and for that gospel, that hot gospeler mood you put us in there right now. And Pat, we leave you to give the formal closing to bring our very important discussion to a close. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Tennyson, my co-chair. Just want to thank all the speakers and audience for this true political education that we've received here this afternoon. Walimu is right. We need to re-energize our efforts in order to ensure that we liberate ourselves from imperialism, and that liberation is possible, and we've come a long way. I think it's important to recognize those efforts, the efforts of the Cubans, the efforts actually of the Haitians, the Cubans, and other revolutionary movements that have at least allowed many of us to be able to move freely wherever we are at present. I just want to say that Pambazuka News welcomes short and informative submissions on matters pertaining to global Africa. To those of you who are interested in writing about Venezuela or other matters relating to global Africa, please submit your articles to editor@pambazukanews.org. And there is actually information online relating to submission. And if it's in Spanish, we'll get it translated. So please, everyone, join with me to thank our speakers for their wonderful eruditions. Thank you. And good night, everyone, or good day, wherever you are. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.